Baik, selamat malam semua. Selamat datang di webinar Freshwater Fish of Indonesia, chapter ketiga. Sebelumnya perkenalkan saya Dan Indrawati selaku moderator pada kesempatan kali ini. Untuk webinar malam ini kita akan membahas tentang bridging the knowledge gap, essential strategies for effective conservation. With bersama pemateri yang luar biasa yaitu Bapak Dr. Nathaniel Ng. Good evening everyone, welcome to the third chapter of the FFOI or Freshwater Fish of Indonesia webinar. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. I am Dian Indrawati as the moderator for this session. In today's webinar, we will be discussing about bridging the knowledge gap, essential strategies for the effective conservation with our esteemed speaker, Dr. Nathaniel Ng. Before we begin, I would like to invite Marcel for give a speech as a leader from Freshwater Fish of Indonesia.
Okay, thanks for the change. First, welcome to our webinar that has a title, Bridging the Knowledge Gap, Essential Strategy for Effective Conservation. Okay, today we are privileged to learn from Dr. Nathaniel Ng, who will share key strategy for preserving endangered species and protecting natural habitat. This session will also highlight collaborative efforts, including about fund to empower Indonesian conservation. Okay, and thank you for Dr. Nathaniel for joining us today, and let's make the most of today in sight of better future in conservation. Thank you.
Do I start my presentation now?
Must be Dian.
Sorry.
I'm sorry for before we get the presentation, I would like to introduce Dr. Nathaniel Ng, which is Southeast Asia Program Coordinator on IUCN. With the latest education is Master in Environmental Science, University of California, Santa Barbara, and PhD at National University of Singapore. Dr. Nathaniel Ng is a molecular ecologist specializing in philo and population genomic conservation genetics. With the research areas include sexual selection in insects, coastal environmental economics and management, evolutionary mechanism of avian diversification across island. Some of experience, which is freshwater fish conservation, management with NGOs, Mandai Nature, aquatic conservation in zoos and aquariums, sea aquariums in Mandai Wildlife Group, and current role is collaborates with IUCN SSC, ASEAN Species Action Partnership, and partner with governments, NGOs, scientists, and researchers to drive protection of critically endangered freshwater fish in Southeast Asia. Now I would like to invite Dr. Nathaniel to give us the presentation.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm Nathaniel, so I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see how to share my screen. Sorry, I just installed Zoom on this computer, so it's a little bit crazy.
Okay.
Okay. There. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Actually, not afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you for taking time out of your busy Friday evening to attend this webinar. As mentioned before, I'm now with this conservation organization called Shoal, and we focus specifically on freshwater fish, which is, obviously a taxon that hasn't received much conservation attention, even though they are so important. Freshwater fish are so important. So what exactly is Shoal? Shoal essentially, was created in order to drive conservation to freshwater fish. So freshwater fish make up the largest number of critically endangered vertebrate species in Southeast Asia, right? And in fact, they are tied with amphibians as the most threatened vertebrate taxon, and yet there is so little conservation action for them. So Shoal, we are hosted by Synchronicity Earth and Rewild. These are two other large NGOs. So we were created in order to drive direct conservation partnerships for freshwater fish, right? To channel funding and all these resources to try and prevent freshwater fish extinction worldwide, right? And Southeast Asia is a very important priority area for us. So we are quite a small team. Shoal was actually only formed in 2019. So there's Mike Balzer, our executive director. There's also Michael Edmonston, communications and engagement lead. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Sometimes when you're presenting from home, these things happen. So we also have Truly, who just joined us, Truly Wu, our US coordinator. She also just joined a short time ago. So Truly and myself are the two newest members of Shoal. And as for me, myself, I only joined about a month ago, but I have some prior experience working with Shoal, so that kind of helped. And also Georgie, who was our program director. Not director, our program coordinator. So together, just the five of us, right? We make up the Shoal team. So what exactly do we do? And most importantly, these three things, right? First, we try to raise global awareness of threatened freshwater fish. Secondly, we then raise funds to drive freshwater conservation. So we try and raise the money and the resources so that freshwater conservation can happen. And third, we then work with conservation partners to drive the protection of species, in freshwater habitats all around the world. So here I just kind of put a lot of logos of some of the organizations that we work with. It's not an exhaustive list, but we work with all these people, right, around the world to try and protect freshwater habitats. So zooming into Southeast Asia's critically endangered fishes, right? So freshwater vertebrates, and this is a worldwide thing, they are declining at 2 times the rate of other vertebrates from terrestrial and marine ecosystems, right? So very, very declining at terrible rates, right? And Southeast Asia itself is home to 90 species of critically endangered freshwater fishes, and they come from all different taxonomic groups. They make up the largest group of critically endangered species in the region, right? And these 4 pictures down here kind of represent the 4 general, most imperiled habitat types, right, that host the majority of these critically endangered freshwater fish. You have the blackwater and peatland fishes, the peat swamps, the swamp forests. These hold a lot of threatened fish can be found in these habitats. Also the lake endemics. So these are fish that are found only in 1 or 2 lakes, and a lot of them are threatened by things like invasive species or, a lot of harvesting, right? So the lake endemics are also very threatened. You also get the migratory riverine fishes. So these fishes are very threatened. It's the biggest problem, right, in places like the Mekong. So you get these big, huge riverine fish that need to migrate, right, to spawn. But because of dams, because of all sorts of, changes in the river course or water extraction, they can no longer do that. And a lot of them are dying out, right? You also get the highland stream fishes. So these are fishes that live higher up, right, higher altitudes, up in the mountains, in the foothills, where you get like fast-flowing streams. So those fishes also are threatened. A lot of them also in Indochina or, in the Annamite mountain range, for example, you get lots of fishes like that. So what does it take to conserve a species? In general, I mean, since you're talking about species that are already very threatened, this is kind of a general flow that needs to happen. You start with figuring out what you're protecting, right? So that's the taxonomic identity, right? And then once you've figured out the taxonomic identity, what exactly you're trying to protect, you then need data on population and distribution. How many of them are there? Where can you find them, right? Is it just one location? Is it multiple locations? Is it only one watershed? Is it multiple watersheds, right? And then you get to the point, once you figure that out, then you can get to the point where you start to identify the threats. Why is it threatened in the first place? Are they able to breed? Are people taking them out, or is there enough habitat for the fish, right? So that's when you identify the threats and you characterize them. So you understand what is causing populations to be low, what is causing the fish to become endangered, right? And once you've done that, you've identified the threat and characterized them, then you can start to address them. And of course, depending on what the threats are, there usually are different things that you can do, right, to address the various threats that the species is facing. And then after that, once you put in the measures you need, right, to try and mitigate those threats, you then monitor and see whether or not the measures you've put in are successfully protecting the fish, right? So this order of conserving, the entire conservation process, so to speak, each step relies on the step before. So before you figure out population and distribution, you have to first figure out the taxonomic identity, right? Because if you can't even figure out what you're trying to protect, there's no way you can assess how many there are, right? And in order to identify and characterize the threats, you must first know where the species is found and how many there are, right? So each step relies on the step before. So whenever you're thinking of, you're looking at a species that's threatened, right? And you want to protect it. One very important thing to ask is what the status is, what information you have for each of these levels, and at which level do you need to go in and figure, collect information, gather data, right? So now zooming in on Indonesia in particular, it's the largest country in Southeast Asia. I mean, you guys are massive, right? 17,000 islands, that's crazy. And the best thing, the most interesting thing, the most amazing thing about Indonesia is you straddle three mega diverse bioregions. So as a biology nerd, I'm sure most of us here are biology nerds. We're all very excited by that, right? So many different, very interesting species that are found nowhere else, right? So you have Sunderland over here in the kind of brownish orange circle. You also have Wallacea, which includes islands like Sulawesi, East Nusa Tenggara, all of those islands. And you also have New Guinea, right? West Papua. Extremely interesting, and possibly, is it one of the most diverse places in the entire world, West Papua. So very, very interesting location as well. And Indonesia encompasses all of these amazing places. So because of this very, very diverse habitat type, right, and all this rich species diversity with high levels of endemism, it's no surprise that you get so many interesting things in so many different islands, and it therefore is no surprise that there are a certain number of critically endangered freshwater fish that can be found in Indonesia. So altogether, there are 48 species, identified species for now. So Indonesia's critically endangered fish, they are found pretty much all over Indonesia. And one of the first things I did actually with Shoal in the past was I collaborated with them. Back then I was with Mandai Nature. So together we worked on this strategic conservation framework for ASAP freshwater fishes, right? So this was published in 2023. And in there, for example, we did a deep dive into each of the Southeast Asian countries and the critically endangered species that they harbor. And out of the 48 species in Indonesia, we can split them roughly into 7 groups based on their habitats and the recommended conservation actions, right? So these 7 groups can be seen in this slide. You have the peat swamp forest specialists, like I mentioned before, about 13 species. You can find 13 species of them in Indonesia. We have 7 species found in the Sulawesi's ancient lakes, the Malili Lake system, Lake Lindu, Lake Poso, right? Those places. We have 21 species that are found in West Papua. So these are largely rainbow fishes, right? Very popular in the aquarium trade. together with the beach lobster especially, is also very popular. Very pretty fishes, and they are generally found in the lakes and streams in West Papua. You also get two very special endemic species that are only found in Lake Tawa in Aceh. We also get the Javan lost species. So these are quite interesting. So they are found in Java, and there are 4 species. And finally, the last 2 groups, right? They're really just single species each. You get Beta Fasca and Oryzias timorensis, right? Found in Sumatra and Timor Island, respectively. So these 7 groups, right, encompass the 48 critically endangered Indonesian freshwater fish species. So now I'll deep dive a little bit more into each group, right? So we'll start with the Sulawesi ancient lakes. So Sulawesi's lake systems are very deep and very ancient. Sulawesi has a very interesting biogeographical history, right? It's kind of formed from separate fragments from different major continents in the past. They all kind of floated together and then docked together and made this extremely interesting island, right? And Sulawesi's history is extremely ancient, right? So a lot of the lakes there have been there for a really long time. And, you know, all these ancestral fish and shrimp and snail species that first inhabited the place, they then evolved into very different, very special forms, very different species, right? And that's what makes them so biologically interesting and so valuable, right, and so precious. So there are 7, is it 7? Yeah, there are 7 critically endangered species in Sulawesi's lakes for fish. You have Adrianictes scuriti, Adrianictes roseni, and Mugilogobius amadi from Lake Poso. All 3 of these species are thought to possibly be extinct. So that's really quite sad. You also have Oryzia soerotoi from Lake Tiu. If I'm mispronouncing any of these names, I'm really sorry, but feel free to correct me. There's also Paratherina labiosa from Lake Wawontoa or Lake Lontoa. I think that's another name for it. Tondanictes cotylati from Lake Tondano, and Xenopoecilus saracinorum from Lake Lindu, right? So if you look right now at the threats column over here, you can see that generally speaking, the major threats for these lake species are invasive species, also sedimentation, largely due to deforestation, because a lot of these lakes, of course, they used to be surrounded by forests, right? But as they become developed, people cut the forest down. So then sediment goes to the lakes and it affects the water quality. You get lots of sedimentation, also affects how the bottom of the lake is, right? And there are, of course, follow-up effects on the fish and the animals that live there, right? So a lot of the conservation needs identified for this group involve things like surveys, because you first got to figure out, remember that thing about, oh, how many are there, where are they found, right? So surveys are definitely necessary. Elimination or control of invasive species, that's actually a very big question. And I'm always telling people that's the kind of like the great, you know, that if somebody somewhere manages to answer that question, how do you effectively eliminate or control invasive species? Wow, that's really, really powerful information, right? And that's sorely needed, right, for Sulawesi's lake species. And of course, also ex situ breeding. So for a lot of these cases in which you're not sure whether or not the situation in the wild is actually going to be able to support them in the long term, then ex situ breeding becomes a potential solution. Yeah, so ex situ is a tricky thing, right? Ex situ is something that a lot of people like to immediately default to ex situ as a solution for all the threatened species, but it's actually not true, because you don't want to get in a situation where you say, oh, you know, we're going to do ex situ, and then you go and take the fish out, and then it turns out that you can't do it under human care, and then they end up dying even more quickly, right? And it always, the natural habitat is going to be better for the species. So ex situ breeding should only be taken as a last resort, right? If there is no way of protecting the natural habitat, or if there's no way, you know, if things are too far gone, only then do you, you know, look to ex situ breeding as a potential option, right? So for Sulawesi's ancient lakes, given the difficulty of controlling invasive species, and in some places it's difficult, right? Because you get a lot of human use. If you get lots of sedimentation, it's difficult to reverse that. So ex situ breeding might need to happen, right? If you're going to preserve these species. And I also put over here some pictures of two other very important species groups from Sulawesi, mostly critically endangered. Almost all of them are critically endangered. The shrimp, right, the Caridina species flock, also from the Malili Lakes, extremely endangered. They are all critically endangered. And also the Tylomilania, the rabbit snails, right, also all critically endangered. So any efforts, right, we do in Sulawesi's ancient lakes for the fish will hopefully also be able to have good effects for these other two critically endangered species flocks, right? So overall, the major gaps, information gaps and needs for Sulawesi's ancient lakes, of course, questions regarding population status, distribution and movements of these species, effects of invasive species, habitat quality, whether or not it's possible to restore habitat, how to control the invasive species, and also ex situ husbandry and breeding. So lots and lots and lots of gaps. Yeah. Okay, so the next major group, and this is a group that I love a lot, the peat swamp specialists. So peat swamps are very special habitats, and Indonesia holds 50% of the world's tropical peat swamps. So a lot, right? Extremely special habitats. You have a lot of species living in very acidic waters, right? They are kind of mysterious and dark and very acidic. And peat swamps, they face rapid and sustained destruction for a lot of development and agriculture. In the past, I mean, depending on who you talk to, but a lot of people think peat swamps are like, oh, they're trash habitat. You know, it's just a swamp, you know, we should drain them, you know, convert them, make them useful. Well, that's actually not true, right? Peat swamps are extremely important, especially for freshwater fish and plants, right? These two groups, they hold very high endemism for these two groups. And a lot of your very popular betta and parosperminas actually come from these kinds of habitats. So if you actually look at the list of critically endangered species, there are peat swamp specialists, they are all bettas and parosperminas, right? The two groups. And they're also very popular in the aquarium trade, which actually also sometimes spells really bad news. Them, especially when they are already very endangered, right? So you get species like Betta burdigala from Bangka. Betta hendra is also another popular aquarium species. Miniopita is also taken, right? And Rutilans, Parosperminus ornaticoda is also targeted. So that's an additional layer of threat, right, from aquaria. But overall, for the peat swamp specialists, the largest threat is habitat destruction. So the thing about peat swamp specialists is they're generally very small fish, right? They are small. They don't move large distances, and they generally only are found in quite a small area. So if you have one small area and all the individuals for their species are only found in the area, once you destroy the area, the species goes extinct, right? So peat swamp specialists generally very range restricted, and as a result, of course, the conservation needs beside the first necessary layers would be things like your taxonomic investigation, but surveys very, very important. And how do you restore peat swamp, right, in areas in which it can be destroyed? Or how do you then quickly identify areas that are still existing? How do you quickly identify areas to prioritize for protection, right? That's very important for the peat swamp specialists. Because they are generally also very range restricted and found in small areas, ex situ breeding becomes a very powerful tool, potential. If all the world's individuals are found in a spot that you cannot protect, right, or very difficult to protect, or you're not confident you can protect, then the best thing to do would be to immediately kind of try and set up a breeding population ex situ. So if anything happens to the wild population, at least you have something to fall back on, right? In the future, maybe you can do release, right, to augment the wild population, or maybe if they really the habitat's gone, at least you still have the species, and in the future, if you can restore the habitat, you can then release them again, right? So because of that, ex situ has also been identified as being very important for peat swamp specialists. Also, for the species that are popular in the ornamental fish trade, they are being taken in numbers that, well, people are not really sure how many, right? Maybe it's not that big of a problem. Maybe it's a big problem. We don't really know, right? How many are being taken up? We don't really know. So that would be also a useful piece of information, right, for people to figure out, because then you can figure out whether or not there's any threat or how great the threat is from that. And yeah, so lots of threats that peat swarm specialists are facing. So for as far as the information gaps are, what the information gaps are, you get things again: population status, distribution or movements, where they are found, taxonomic research for some species, because for certain groups, because they can be quite difficult to tell apart, and you can get, again, because they don't move around a lot, so you can get lots of speciation even in a relatively small area. So taxonomic research will be very helpful in figuring out what exactly you're looking at each time you see a betta or a Parasforminus. Habitat protection information, of course, extremely important. Where? How do you prioritize? Where do you prioritize? Habitat restoration for species which are found in areas where the habitat has already been altered. Is it possible to restore habitat for these threatened species? Information on ornamental trait, information on ex situ husbandry, and also this is quite important, whether or not you can actually, when you have information on ornamental trait and also whether or not the population is doing okay, you can then start talking about things like sustainable collection, because it's very important that communities also benefit from protecting these species, right? So sustainable collection, if you can find a way that to get these species exported in a sustainable manner, right, then you can get the interest of communities, right? People will be able to benefit from protecting the species, and that is very, very important, right? Especially for range-restricted species such as the peat swarm specialists. Okay, so the next group, the West Papua lakes and streams, right? A lot of rainbow fish found there. So West Papua, one of the richest centers of biodiversity on Earth, extremely interesting location. There are 21 critically endangered species. So if I were to put them all one by one in a table, it will not fit in the slide. Therefore, I just made the executive decision to just group them by threat, right? So there are multiple species per row in this slide. We group them according to 3 general categories depending on the greatest threat that they face. There's a whole bunch of species here for which climate change is identified as the largest threat. So climate change is actually a threat for everything, right? I mean, not just the West Papuan species. It's a threat for the peat swarm specialists. It's a threat for the lake species. It's a threat for everything, right? Because as climates change, temperatures increase, for example, like a lot of the peat swarm species actually, they breed better in cooler weather. So if the temperature keeps going up, then they cannot breed, and then that's it. They're just going to get more and more endangered, right? So climate change is actually a threat for not just the Papuan fish, but also a lot of other species. But for these species here, for example, in the first row, climate change is the main threat. A lot of what people say, is things like because you get lowered water levels during the dry season, and as it gets hotter, it gets even lower, and then all these fish get predated on by other animals, right? Or they die out because their streams or their rivers dry up, right? So that is a very real threat for a lot of Papuan species. The second major threat that was identified, the second group of species, you get human incursions. So this is pretty much the same thing that you see in other places as well for other species. You get logging and land clearing for settlement. And you also potentially get invasive species, right? Because where humans go, they generally bring some invasive species with them. It generally follows human settlement, right? And the third major group is just one big fat threat is we just don't know anything about them, where they are and their threats. So that's another big question mark. And, scientists feel like they are under great threat, but you don't even know enough to fully characterize, right, the threats or explain. So for these 3 particular threat types, the conservation needs are different, but also kind of the same, right? Again, surveys, very important. Everything needs surveys, right? Because we know so little, right? Surveys for population, surveys for the habitat quality, figure out whether or not how bad the situation is or how good. I mean, could go either way. How to protect habitats, how to restore habitats, whether or not we can, again, eliminate or control invasive species. And for all 3 threats, ex situ breeding is potentially needed, right, it can potentially be identified as a solution if the threats in the wild become too difficult to handle. For example, things like climate change will be very difficult to handle. You can't change the climate of an entire lake, right? So in that kind of a situation, if the situation gets really dire, then ex situ might become a need, right? So yeah, your information gaps, again, all of that, right? But you add on perhaps more strongly for this group, the effects of climate change on populations. So that will be something that is interesting and important to figure out. Okay, the next group, also very interesting, the Lake Tawa endemics. So Lake Tawa is the largest lake in Aceh province, right? I hear it's very beautiful. I've never been there, so it'll be nice to visit someday. But anyway, Lake Tawa also hosts very important ecosystems, and they sustain two critically endangered cyprinids. So the cyprinids are the fish that are related to the carps and the barbs, right? And the two endangered cyprinids are Rasbora tawarensis and Poropanthias tawarensis, right? Both of these species are actually very popular as food fish and apparently very tasty. Shouldn't be saying that about critically endangered fish, but it's true. So for both of them, overfishing is a major threat, right? Human settlement and tourism, including all the issues that it brings, right? Things like, again, sedimentation, pollution, all of that, right? It comes in, and also invasive species, right? So for these two, the major conservation needs will be things like surveys to figure out how many there are, right? Also, how they move around the lake. That's actually quite an important thing to figure out, right? Because a lot of these species, they may not stay at the same spot, right? So if you just keep looking, for example, you just keep looking at the same spot and you're like, hey, they seem to be doing quite well, but then it turns out that they're only there at a certain time of the year, and when they move out of them, then they get harvested, right? So you get all these kinds of things. So knowing how they move around in the lake is also important, right? Of course, for fish species like this, sustainable fishing practices is very important. Habitat quality restoration, and of course, invasive species control, right? Depending on the invasive species that are there, they could have very bad effects on these native endangered species, right? So the major information gaps would be things like, of course, the population status, what kinds of fishing pressure they are experiencing, what kinds of sustainable fishing practices you can then recommend, right? Invasive species, distribution and movements, habitat quality, and whether or not you can restore the water, restore the habitat, right, to make it good for these fish again. Okay, so the next group are the Javan lost species. So Java is the world's most populous island, right? And so development has resulted in a lot of the native freshwater habitats being destroyed. So these 4 species are all possibly extinct, right? They haven't been seen in a very, very long time. So if you look at the rightmost part of the slide, you can see, oh, some of them have not been seen in 80 years, right? It was only last seen in the 1850s, right? So these things, like they haven't been seen in a very, very long time. So given that the places where they were reported from are all now very like developed, right? So there are a lot of humans live there, it's heavily used. Scientists are generally not very confident that these fish still exist. But of course, we can't say for sure, right? So because of that, what we've recommended, at least in the conservation plan, is that these 4 possibly extinct species kind of lowered priority, because the others, if you know that they are actually there, then there's a little bit more urgency to protect them, right? Whereas for these 4, it's really not very likely that they're still alive. However, of course, if anybody is going to, surveying those areas and happens to find something, that would be great, right? So if it gets to the point where, oh my goodness, I now have proof that Barbonymus platysoma is still existing, that it's going to be crazy, right? It will be a very, very interesting. It will be a very interesting case, right, for conservation. So so your major information gaps will, of course, first be thorough surveys to figure out whether or not the species are still extinct, whether or not they still exist. Also taxonomic research to figure out if, hey, some of these species they haven't been seen since they were described, right? So there's also a layer of figuring out exactly that taxonomy layer, right? And is it really the species that I've rediscovered, right? And once you figure that out, if any of these four are found to actually exist, then wow, everything else starts to come online, right? You need to figure out the population status, the habitat quality, given the places where they are found, have such people living there and they've been, modified for so long. Can you improve the habitat quality, right? How are they moving around? And also ex situ husbandry and breeding, right? Depending on whether or not they are low numbers, probably will be low numbers, right? So those will all need to be answered, right? If any of these four species are actually rediscovered. Okay, so the last two groups, right, they are really just single species, Beta fusca and Oryzias timorensis. So both of these are actually also kind of similar to the Javan lost species. They're only known from a very few specimens. They have not been seen for many, many, many years, right? So Beta fusca is from North Sumatra near to Medan. Described from only 2 specimens in 1908. Crazy. And you often find fish labeled as this species in the trade, but the scientists think that they are most likely misidentified, and they are not real Beta fusca, right? You also get Oryzias timorensis. This is a kind of rice fish, right? It's been described from less than 10, it's supposed to be less than 10 specimens, not more than 10 specimens, my mistake. It was described in 1911, so also a very long time ago. And neither of these species have been found in more recent surveys around Medan and on Timor, right? So similar to the Javan lost species, the information gaps, what is the need? The information needs, right, would be thorough surveys, taxonomic research, and if there exists, more research into population status, habitat quality, distribution, ex situ husbandry, and also how to restore habitat quality. Okay, so going back to this, am I going too fast, by the way?
No, it's okay.
Okay,
No,
great.
okay.
Thank you. Okay, so going back to this simple flow chart that I presented on earlier, if we actually look at each of the steps here, right? For taxonomic identity, the first step, immediate information on taxonomic identity is necessary for at least 4 of the CR groupings. It's been identified as a primary need for at least 4 groups. And that's already the first level, and already 4 out of the 7 need it, right? For population and distribution information, it's an immediate information need for all 7 critically endangered groupings. Threat identification and characterization, also for all 7. How to address the threats, also for all 7. So essentially, what this means is just that we know very little, right? And data and information, a lot of data and a lot of information will need to be collected in order to better protect, right, each of these 48 endangered species, critically endangered freshwater species from Indonesia, right? So yeah, lots of gaps. Depending on the species you're looking at, you can narrow down more easily which is the most pressing, but lots of gaps and lots of work, right, to be done before we can properly protect a lot of these fish. So here I start talking about shoal-supported conservation. So we've worked closely with funding collaborators, Mother Nature's City Earth and ASAP, right? And to enable conservation work spearheaded by a lot of our fantastic Indonesian conservation collaborators. So these are all led by Indonesians who want to make a difference, right, for the freshwater fish that they have in their backyards, right? You have PKGB. Pusat, I'm sorry if I mispronounced this, okay? Pusat Riset Konservasi Gajah dan Biodiversitas, right? In Aceh.
Right.
So they have done great work on Poropanthias tawarensis. This is one of the 2 critically endangered species in Lake Tawa. And the work that their project encompasses, right? Population distribution and habitat surveys, right? Identifying threats and also analyzing these threats, and also community engagement, right? Figuring out, talking to communities, figuring out, how people are catching the fish, whether or not, how interested they are, whether or not catches have changed through the years, all these things, right? And also figure out exactly where these fish are in the lake, how do they move around? A lot of these questions, right? PKGB is working on them, right? The second project that is very close to my heart, Langkah University's project. It's based out of Bangka, right? And they work with Beta Bertigala. Again, very good work coming out of Langkah University. Work on population distribution and habitat surveys for this very important species. Community engagement. There's also a strong ex situ component for this project. Population augmentation and also monitoring. So this project is very interesting to me because it really, they went in and they're working on the full spectrum, right? If you look at that flow chart, this case has made it such that they actually can work, right, at each of the steps, from surveys all the way down to monitoring, right, the entire spectrum. The third project is one that has just started a short time ago, a very promising new NGO, Tropical Conservation Association, right, in West Kalimantan. This is another very interesting species to me. I'm a little bit biased towards the blackwater fish. So Parasrominus ornithicoda, right, again, surveys for presence, very important, surveys for distribution, right. Identifying of the threat, right, figuring out, part of it is also just to figure out, are there like large numbers being taken out, right, because of the trade? How exactly are they being impacted, right? These are all very important questions. And also community engagement, because it's very important. You have to get the buy-in of the people on the ground. If the people, local people living on the ground don't support conservation, it's very difficult for conservation to happen, right? So yeah, community engagement. In Sulawesi, we have two very good projects ongoing. Celebica, right, in Central Sulawesi, and the species they're working on is Xenobacillus saracinorum, right? So with this one also population surveys, right, habitat surveys, figuring out whether or not they're still there, how many they are, right, very important things. Community outreach, very important. Threat identification, because if you're going to suggest, if you're going to protect them, you need to know what you're working with, right? What the threats are. So threat identification and analysis as well. And progress also in Central Sulawesi, but in a different lake system, right? They're working on 3 species that are thought to possibly be extinct, right? Mugillogobius amadi, Adrianictes cruiti, and Adrianictes roseni. So a lot of their work involves surveys for presence, population, and distribution. Also identifying threats, right? Conservation planning, as well as community engagement. So these 3 species that progress are working on are difficult ones because they are so rare that people think they may be extinct, right? So the surveys have to be very, very thorough, right? Because it's not easy to say for sure that a species is completely extinct, right? So it's another level of difficulty lah. if I can term it as such, right? Proving that something is extinct is very difficult. Yeah. So lots of good work coming from each of these 5 organizations, and we really look forward to, as we move forward into the future, enabling more of such work, right? Maybe potentially growing these projects or working with new conservation collaborators from Indonesia to push for better protections for your very precious critically endangered fish. So, there we go. Okay, so how do you reach us, or if you have a great idea or you want to start working on freshwater fish conservation, right? If you have an idea for a project, how do you actually reach us, right? A lot of it is, again, like I mentioned before, a lot of what we do is part of what we do, right? A very large part of what we do is raising funds and then disseminating those funds, right, to conservation projects so they can actually do the conservation work, right? So far, we've been very actively involved in these 2 grants, right, in the past couple of years, the ASAP species grants that went out between 2022 and 2023, and also the Shoal ASAP freshwater fish conservation grant, which was from last year until this year, right? Upcoming right now, there is actually a there is a proposal request thing, right, call, right, that's out right now, the Fonseca Species Conservation Fund. And this is the second request. So this is actually specifically focused on Asia Pacific. So that's us, right? And it's targeted at early career conservationists. So all you young, less low, younger than 35-year-old people, please send in projects if you have anything interesting. Grants are up to USD 25,000, so that's quite a lot. And I'm very glad that they specifically mentioned freshwater fish as a group that they are looking at funding, right? Very good. So if you have an project in mind, please do apply at this website. The show website, essentially, you can find the link there. And also, of course, this is just the one that's active right now, right? But as we manage to raise funds, there will be more. So do keep an eye out on the show website and also the ASAP website, because they also have grant calls that they will, release at intervals. And I put this screenshot over here of the strategic framework because a lot of the information that I've spoken about today, and all that stuff that I've said, right, it can be found, better explanations in greater detail in this strategic framework, which you can also access from the show website. And in there, you can also read about, other synthesis of the information, right, about different habitats around Asia, different countries, right? We also have country focus, we have habitat focus, we have all these kinds of focus, right, within the plan. So if you're interested, lots of information in the strategic framework, do go and take a look. All right, that's about all that I have for you guys today. Thank you for your patience. And I hope I haven't been speaking too quickly or too whatever. But anyway, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you for Nathaniel. I'm sorry. Okay. Maybe the moderator have an issue, so we can change to question. What question and ask? Maybe someone wanna ask to Dr. Nathaniel. You can raise the hand.
Ya, gabung sana. Gabung sana.
Okay. There is a question. Okay, Mr. Luke.
Yes. Yep. Sorry. Okay. Just wanted to get. I'm working with a lot of wild better at the moment. And I've come across. I work very closely with. I'm on the ground a lot, and I'm working very closely with hobbyists also, because I'm in contact with a lot of hobbyists also. So there's always been this debate. I want to get Dr. Nathaniel's opinion on what's the best way to keep for hobbyists to keep these swamp fish. As a conservationist, I've always been pushing the idea that hobbyists these fish need to be kept in conditions as close to the natural parameters as possible. Yet hobbyists always push back against me and say that such fish can adapt to their water and they don't need to mimic the natural habitat.
Oh,
What do you
that's a
think?
tricky one.
Yeah.
That's a tricky one. So I will first say that. So I will just give, this is my personal opinion. This is just what I feel. I agree more closely with you. Simply because if you are going to be going at it from a conservation point of view, right?
Yeah.
You want to be breeding individuals that will be able to survive in the wild.
Yes.
So you don't want to inadvertently select for, certain genotypes that do better with water conditions that are different from the wild. So just from that point of view, it will be important to maintain them in parameters that closely mimic the wild state, right?
Yep.
I do see to a certain degree the argument for, kind of relaxing that if the species can take it, right? Because then you can perhaps be more efficient with breeding larger numbers. I guess overall it's you kind of need to strike a balance. I wouldn't dare to, just because of numbers, you therefore just completely ignore the wild situation, conditions, right? But maybe you can kind of play with both. You breed a larger number, starting number, maybe using the easier to get conditions, and then you start to kind of get them used to the wild habitat when you the wild conditions when you have kind of like a larger group to start experimenting on, if that makes sense. So kind of like a balance.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, anyone? Maybe Mr. Luke? That early. Okay. Hello, Mr. Luke. Does anyone want to ask? Maybe you can raise hand. Or maybe I will read in the comment of chat. Oh, the moderator come back.
Oh, there were a couple of questions on the chat.
Yeah, in the okay. Maybe
Uh,
this is it.
okay, I'll just answer. I mean, the question from Nohafiz Hanaf.
Yeah, Hafiz.
Okay. Any successful conservation projects? Okay, there have been, right? Definitely. Again, there's been very little effort on fish, so I dare not say that I know a lot, right? About I don't, as in, how do I say this? I don't have a lot of examples for fish, right? But for other species, there has been a lot, right? I mean, things like the Arabian oryx, for example, that's a very, very famous example. You also get things like the Mauritian pink, is it Mauritius or Madagascar? I can't remember, the pink pigeon, right? And you also, but most of them are from other taxon groups, right? As far as fish are concerned, perhaps a good, more recent example would be one of the Godites from Mexico. They actually just managed to release some of a species that was formerly extinct in the wild, in closely managed, but also kind of like a semi-wild waterway. So they've been successfully reintroduced, right? Whether or not they continue to prosper in the wild is anybody's guess, right? They are continuing to monitor it, but that would be the closest thing that comes to my mind, if you're talking about proven success with a fish, right, in recent years. I can actually find that species. I forgot what it is, which is terrible, but they managed to do it for that species, and they're now working on another one called the golden skiffia. So both of these are from Mexico. Yeah. I hope that answered your question.
Dr. Nathaniel,
Yeah.
this is me. Oh, sorry.
Hi.
Can see me?
Yes.
Okay, so the question is just like, if I'm studying for the coastal fishes. Okay. It's out of topic. It's not freshwater, but it's coastal fishes. So the case is like they overfishing because due to the targeted for the swim bladder, for example.
Oh.
Okay, so it's like what is that? Targeted for the something internal organ, yeah, for exporting to Hong Kong, exporting to Taiwan, something like that, because of the value.
Yeah.
So that's the threat I can see. So I'm not conservationist because I'm taxonomist. So that's why I can tackle the taxonomy, but I'm just thinking what's the ideal method if the cases like targeted for the commercial value. Yeah, commercial value. Yeah, I forgot the terms. Yeah. So give me the mechanism, the ideal issue about that issue.
Okay,
Yeah.
so commercial value is very tricky. And again, I mean, depending on which case you're talking about, you get all different kinds of solutions, right? So I can't give you a single solution for it. A lot of the time when it comes to a situation like that, when you have, let's say, a threatened species, and I mean the totoaba in the Gulf of Mexico, I don't know if you
Really, Totoaba McDonald's.
Yeah. So totoaba, you know the situation is so tough, right? And unfortunately, the only thing that comes to my mind now is regulation. At that point, governments
on cyanide. Actually, I'm working on family cyanide.
Oh, which one is that? Actually, I don't know.
Family cyanide is on the Totoaba McDonald's. Yeah, that's
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, for species like that, it really just seems like the best thing that you can do because it's so urgent, right? You urgently need to work on it now. It's really going to be regulation, right? You need the community, outreach, right? Education to let people understand the importance of these species and how we cannot drive them extinct. And then there needs to be a certain amount of regulatory control. So governments need to, set laws, right? And they also, more importantly, need to enforce them, right? Because that's always the tricky part because it's easier to set laws but very difficult to actively enforce them, to check, to monitor, right? And it's really tricky. I mean, these things require a lot of resources, right? So that's why it's such a difficult question to answer. But if you get a case like that, the first thing I think of is government regulation. Unfortunately, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question? Okay, there's a question from Leonardo from FFOI. Oh, fish that have not been identified with certainty. So that one is tricky. I think for that kind of a question, as far as identification is concerned, the best way to address that is to, of course, work with your universities, right? The universities that are nearby with expertise. We do have a lot of links with taxonomic experts, right? And we work a lot with them for the projects. So that probably is your best bet, right? And if, after inquiry, you have reason to believe that this is a critically endangered species or they're extremely imperiled, and they deserve conservation attention, then please do write in, right? I mean, there needs to be so much information on these things, so please do reach out if you feel like something that you found is of great conservation need, right, of great conservation value. That's pretty much all I can say, I guess. But yeah, so tap on your local universities, tap on whatever taxonomic expertise is available to you. And if we will be happy to help in whatever way we can, right? If we are able to link you with these people, we'll be glad to help. I can't guarantee that the taxonomic experts will respond, but we can definitely try. That's all I can say, I guess. Okay, another question from Momomi Hikaru about that one I cannot tell you, I'm sorry, I have no idea. Lobo Trilos, I have no idea.
Okay, I already answered that.
Oh, wow, very nice. Yeah, sorry.
Baik, apa ada lagi pertanyaan? Dari Rian Loh ini, raise hand mau bertanya kah atau?
Ya, sudah.
Oh, udah. Baik. Another question.
Okay, maybe me.
Ya, silakan Bang.
Okay. First, actually, fish database in Indonesia is very lack of data. So, talking about data, we have a few data in here. So now, FFOI, we are currently compiling data on Indonesia fish biodiversity. And actually, the result is a book. Maybe it's already sent to you. So, is there a way for our work to align with social initiative? So, especially in updating conservation status Indonesia, there is a data deficiency, and I think some species must be renew the conservation status in Indonesia because threat in here is very, very much. Okay.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And talking about the taxonomic research, actually, in Indonesia, it's a very little project or research about the taxonomic. So the data is very few too. Actually, now FFOI and Mr. Dr. Nur Hafiz Hanafi from Malaysia, he has expert on family Cyanidae. We want to work to make a monograph about family Cyanidae in Kalimantan and Sumatra. Maybe can we combine? Maybe I don't know how to we collaborate about this, because monograph is important in here. When the taxonomist research working in Indonesia, the key species is very small data. It's very hard to us to identify the fish in here because there is no data about morphometry or even analyze DNA.
Yeah.
Then talking about in situ and ex situ conservation, actually we now want to make a project about the adoption species and adoption ecosystem. So maybe when we're talking about to protect the habitat of fish, it's a little bit tricky. No, not little bit. So very tricky in here because land conservation in here is very fast. So I think there is no other way besides we buy the land and protect them from the land conservation. It's maybe a bit wrong, but I think this is the best way. So we want to make a project about adoption species and adoption ecosystem. So in situ and ex situ is both we working about that in the freshwater fish in Indonesia. Maybe we will try to start in Kalimantan and Sumatra too, because it is very important because land conservation is in here is very fast.
Yeah, my goodness.
Yeah. About Parasporonymus, the place that I know that there is much Parasporonymus in here. Last month, it's disappeared. It's very sad.
Yeah, and that's the saddest thing of all.
Yeah.
I mean, when talking about what you mentioned about buying land, that is something that actually has been done elsewhere in the world. But okay, I won't name names but there have been conservation organizations in the past that that was one of their main ways of doing things. That's how they started, right?
Yeah.
And they've done lots of such work. And I'm not saying that it's bad, because sometimes it's good, right? In certain ways, it's really, really good. The tricky thing about that is that you are essentially, what it does is it rewards people and organizations just with a lot of money. And the important thing is the benefits might not end up going to the native people, the local people on the ground. The very important thing with these is the local people need to benefit, right?
Yeah.
If you have a village, right, and then every now and then people go out and they catch fish and they sell them and they get a living from that, it's not good to go in and buy the land and then tell them you cannot catch from now on. Now you get out. You can't
I agree.
So that is the tricky thing, right? And that's why that's why it's so important to work with the communities, to get them to understand why it's important, and to also help them, like if there is a need, right? Alternative livelihoods. How can they do better, right? Or how can they live even better lives if they protect, right? So those are all things that it's not, I'm not saying that the buying of land is impossible, but there are all these intricacies that you need to work through, right? So it will be a very like case by case kind of basis, right? But I far be it for me to ever say that anything is definitely a no. I do think that it's worth exploring depending on the situation.
Dr. Nathaniel, can I ask?
Sure.
Just from the question from Marcel, I just figure out if you can can contribute to like our project, like Cyanide project in Kalimantan. So it's just like you can, okay, I'm taxonomist, I'm identify the potential species in Kalimantan. And then we keep the survey. Okay, we make the survey and then we make the data. Okay, what's you can contribute to the as a conservation, like study on the potential, like population. Is it the population growing or population decreasing, something like that? Like the spawning season, like they harvesting, they overfishing, and maybe they catch in the large. So how you as a conservationist can help, because I'm not conservationist, I'm taxonomist, so I don't know how the method conservationists can help us make the population sustainable to the local community. So I think that's the question I ask you. What's the method? What is the mechanism that whether it method you can mitigate this issue? Understand what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, again, it's not going to be possible to answer like that. That's because depending on which case you're talking about, the answer to that question will be very different, right? So if you're going to talk about, for example, a species that's being harvested in unsustainable numbers, right? Usually for fisheries, you can harvest, and then beyond a certain point, the harvest will start to drop, right?
Yeah.
So because the harvest starts to drop, people actually get less out of it. And normally there are two possible reactions to that. They either increase the collection pressure, so they go out even more, they go out more, right? They fish even more. And then the population the catch just continues dropping until it completely disappears. Or they go, oh, this is no longer making me as much money as I would like. I therefore change to something else, right? So in those cases where you get to a point where the catch has dropped below a certain amount, usually where a conservationist will be able to go in and like try and fight, convince the local people to stop catching so much is to tell them, look, if you stop catching between this period and this period at this particular location, then you allow them to spawn, then maybe next year your catch will improve, right? And of course, you need data to back that up. That has been a very, very powerful argument that people have been using for marine protected areas, because a lot of the times, the immediate pushback is, oh, you shouldn't protect this area because, I'm fishing there. But after the area is protected, scientists start releasing data. Hey, you see, right? Because you've protected this area, now if you fish outside the area, you catch so much more because they are breeding within the protected area and then moving out, right? So you both protect the species while also increasing the catch, right? Of course, this is not something that happens everywhere. Again, it's a case-by-case basis, but this is one example of how you can, for certain species for which it fits, you can then argue to protect a certain location maybe, or to stop catching during the breeding season, right? So these are all things that have been successfully done in the past. Actually, if you're interested in that whole thing, marine protected areas, there's a lot of very interesting case studies from New Zealand, because they were the first to have published a lot of work on that. The power of marine protected areas in increasing fishing returns, right? Instead of decreasing it, actually you end up having more fish. Yeah.
Okay, maybe I will answer about that. Actually, local people ask me when I ask them, can I buy this land so I can protect the fish in there? But they ask, so we cannot take the fish anymore, right? Now I think we have two solutions. First, we want to make cultivate captive breeding of the species, so they will not catch the fish from the nature. And second, we want to make a biotour, so people in there not work as a hunter or fisher anymore, so they become the tour guide. So when people actually in couple years ago, I make a biotour, and many people attract to join this biotour. So maybe when we try to make a more detailed, more good, maybe it will be the answer.
Yeah, possibly. And I mean, that's actually, honestly speaking, that's something that we've been discussing also within our teams, right? You get, for example, bird watching. So I studied birds in the past, so I love birds and have a bit more familiarity with them. You know how so many areas now, because of bird watchers, that you bring in tourism, and then people earn a lot of money, and then they become bird guides, bird hunters, right? If there is a way to do that for fish, it will be so good, because especially for certain species, they're only found in the endemic, right? So if you want to see the fish, you have to come here, right?
Yeah.
And then give money, tourism money, bring tourism money. That's very, very good. As we just need to figure out a way to make it such that people can easily see, or they can easily. That's the thing.
Actually, it works. So people from France, from Spain, from the Netherlands going to Kalimantan to see the fish in the natural habitat. That's maybe the answer to protect the fish. But make local village, local people have a benefit on that
Yes.
conservation act.
Definitely. Like, it has to go back to the local people, because if they don't want to protect the fish, then the fish will never be protected.
Yeah, I agree.
You need to make it worth their while. You need to make it such that they earn money from it, they can earn a living, and it's better than catching the fish.
Yeah.
Definitely, right? You also mentioned sustainable, like breeding, right? And
Yeah.
that is very, very useful. So it's very, very important. And
Yeah.
these are all potential things that we keep discussing, because just within the five of us, the five people in the show, we're like, oh, this is so important, but how do we do it, right? Because we don't have all the answers, of course, and we're not on the ground. So we often have these ideas, but we don't know how to make it happen. And that is why, we are useless without our conservation partners, right? So when it comes to understanding the ground or figuring out, like letting us know, hey, you can do that for this species, it can actually happen, right? We rely fully on our conservation partners, right? We rely on you guys, right, who are actually there working on the ground, right, to let us know. And definitely so SHOW works very closely with ASAP, right? And that's why I keep talking about critically endangered species, because a lot of what we are doing is focused on critically endangered species because of our very close association with ASAP. But that doesn't mean that anything that is not critically endangered we won't work with. If it's good, definitely we will, right? And especially if you're working with a species that then ends up with the habitat being protected, then you end up saving more than one. Glad, we're very, very happy to explore working with it. So anything to do with, like, even if you can find a way to market a sustainably bred fish better, right? Yeah, definitely interested, right? If it can, it comes with protecting the habitat, and then you breed and then you sell, it's somehow certified as sustainable, and you can charge a premium for it, I'm sure people will be willing to buy, right? You can say this is sustainably produced, you are helping to protect the species. A lot of people will be willing to buy, right? So it's getting to that point that's tricky lah. But that's definitely something that you guys should work towards, and we will definitely support it, because it's very, very interesting, right? And that's something that can be very powerful. Actually, if you're interested in that, there is they are called Project Piaba in the Amazon. They actually started with that. They are not doing, I don't think they're doing breeding, but they're doing sustainable collection. So it's one, I'm not exactly sure of how exactly they decided, but I know they work with a lot of scientists to figure out every year we can take how many, right? And it's still sustainable. And then because of that, they earn money. They are doing their bit for conservation, and everyone is happy. So you can try looking at that. I will type it in the group chat. This is what they're called.
Project Piaba. Okay. Thank you.
I know it.
Yeah, very interesting, right? My God, when I read about them, I was so excited.
Project Piaba. Project Piaba. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Nat, for the answer.
No problem.
Alright, is there any question? Apakah ada pertanyaan lain? There is a question from Luke. Is there any update information about Orisias timorensis? And in your presentation, especially Orisias, need to do survey. Is SOAL see this as an emerging issue and will funding this project?
Okay, so Orisias timorensis, I'm not very familiar with the species lah, but as far as I understand, I don't think there has been additional news on them. For a species like Orisias timorensis, which could be extinct, right? It's possibly extinct. We are definitely not opposed, right? So how do I say this? We do think that there is a lower chance of success, but if it's a project that, firstly, if there are other benefits from it, and also if it's, well designed such that, you have some reason to believe that it may still be there and the project is well designed, definitely it's possible that we will fund it, right? Because it is a critically endangered species. So I would definitely not say that we will not fund it. But in general, because normally what happens is we send out a grant call and then you get different proposals, right? If we get other proposals that are working on a species that we are more confident will be successful, we may end up prioritizing that more, but that really depends on whether or not such a proposal comes in. So Oryzis timorensis and all these possibly extinct species are a bit tricky, right? If you have evidence or you have reason to believe that it's still there, then yes, definitely there's a lot more interest, right? But don't let that stop you, because the reality is, even if it's possibly extinct, if it gets rediscovered, that is massive news, and then it suddenly becomes very high priority, right? So it's more like high risk, high return lah. You are putting a greater risk because there's a lower chance of finding it. But if you do find it, the returns are very high. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
All right, thank you, Dr. Nathaniel. Is there any other question? Boleh yang mau bertanya, silahkan. Like,
Is that okay? Another question. Okay, Mr. Herjayanto, Mr. Feril Hasan. Nothing, because okay. Mas Diki.
Ya, izin bertanya Mas. Thanks for the opportunity. Dr. Nathaniel, just ask about the invasive species. I mean, in Sulawesi, where I come from, I think whether we talk about Lake Poso or Lake Malili Lake system or Lake Lindu, I think the main problem is the same about the invasive species and it become worse because like in Lake Poso, the invasive species like Melanochromis auratus, the golden cichlid, is very abundant, and I think the local community is not trying to catch them because the fish they are said it's not quite tasty like Nile tilapia or Oreochromis mozambicus. So the population become increase over the time. So I mean, how about your opinion regarding this? Because I do believe we need projects such as understanding the population size of endemic species, but how about the project like to reduce the population of invasive species? Because this is I think a big problem, because invasive species have a impact not only by the fish, I think, but also other freshwater endemic species like shrimp and crabs or snails. I'm not a fish a researcher. I'm working with Caridaina, endemic species from mostly from the Sulawesi Island. But I think we have the same issue in here about the invasive species.
Yeah, and that is the golden question. Unfortunately, invasive species so far for lakes and a lot of these water bodies, even for ponds, it's a big problem. People around the world have been struggling with this for a long time. And unfortunately, there is still no real solution, no real general solution that I know of. In Australia, so these are like some examples from just all over the place, right? I know they were trying very hard to control Gambusia affinis, the mosquito fish, that one, another horrible invasive everywhere, including in Singapore, is also here, everywhere. And no one has any solution for it. I mean, they tried it, and I remember reading a paper where they said the only solution they found was to drain the entire pond so that everything dries out. But you can't do that with a natural lake, and you can't do it because it will also kill the endangered species. So you can't do that, right? I know there have been efforts on whether or not you can introduce certain diseases that only target the invasive species. And for certain situations, maybe that is useful, but I don't think there's been anything groundbreaking on that front either. So as far as invasive species control is concerned, when it comes to species like Melanochromis auratus, when people are not interested in actually catching them, they have no vested interest in getting the species out, then we really here's where we are at the mercy of the scientists, because if they don't figure something out, we don't have a solution either. And I feel very, very strongly about the Caridina, just because they are so interesting, and the Caridina and the rabbit snails, they are so interesting, and it feels like they just got described and already they're all critically endangered. It's just so sad. And that's why also, unfortunately, for a lot of these species, I keep talking about ex situ. Ex situ should always be a last resort, but unfortunately for some of these species, we are at that point where we have to use the last resort. I can't say for every species, right? Each species is different, but in cases where where it's so urgent and there is no way of removing the invasive, maybe ex situ is what you need to be thinking of. Yeah. It's very unfortunate, but yeah.
Maybe one question from me.
Sure.
Okay. How about the conservation of another aquatic creature like shrimp, crab, snail, like water plant? So I think there is no project about that. Why there is no project about that?
Because
that's my answer. Because crab in here, shrimp in here, especially in the freshwater fish, maybe all of them is a new species or maybe endemic one. So why there is no project about that?
So actually, we'll be very glad to fund that also. Yeah, I mean, the quick answer is really shoal is focused on freshwater habitats. So actually, we would love to, and that's definitely an area we want to move towards in the future. For now, it's really just because we're a very small team. We have only just started fundraising, so we also don't have much money lah. But as in the future, as we continue to grow, right? Hopefully we continue to grow. But as we continue to grow and we get more money that we can disperse, then definitely, I mean, we are focused on freshwater habitats. Anything that's in a freshwater habitat, we will be interested in, right?
Yeah.
If that's why actually it's like, and eventually I do believe we'll get to the point where we start focusing less on, well, not less, but besides also focusing on specific species, we also focus on entire habitats, because that is very important. If you can protect, I mean, if you can help Lake Poso, for example, how many species are you helping, right? So definitely, yeah, we'll be glad to. And in the future, yeah, as we grow.
Yeah. Because I know there is no data about the shrimp, the mollusca, crab, especially in freshwater in Indonesia. So maybe I hope there is in the future there is a project about that. Okay.
And actually also, I mean, talking a little bit about that, And I mean, so I used to, I was a scientist. I mean, I still am a scientist, but in this role, I do less of the science and more of the conservation work, right? But that tricky thing, right, about because we're a conservation organization and I work a lot with conservation people and conservation people who are like, I want my work to protect things. I feel like I'm being torn in two directions because I know the importance of the science. If you don't have the science, you cannot protect, right? But you get people going like, I want my money to directly protect. And you're like, but you need the science first, right?
Yeah,
so there is that struggle, right? Because you need both, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it can be difficult to convince people who don't understand that the money needs to go to the science as well. You can't just go in and say, okay, from now on I'll just protect this. But how do you know that you're actually protecting it if you don't have the science, right? So that is something like that's a little bit of a struggle that I think we will always have to deal with, right, in conservation. But yeah, I mean, we'll
maybe in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Masih ada pertanyaan?
Yeah, before we closing.
Oh,
maybe a attribute? Maybe there is no attribute.
udah nggak ada bang orangnya.
Okay, anyone?
Question before we close the session.
Okay. You want to say something, Mr. Ferrell? Okay. Mr. Herjayanto?
From me, no.
Okay. Okay, maybe we can close. Oh, another question in chat.
Okay, from Dimas Wahyu Pratama, is domestication for several species that human take a benefit from them, like swim bladder, egg, and meat, could be a solution for their population in the world. Siapa ya itu? Okay. Should I repeat? From Dimas Wahyu Pratama, is domestication for several species that human take a benefit from, like swim bladder, egg, and meat, could be a solution for their population in the wild?
It could be. Of course, it depends on which species you're talking about, and whether or not you can bring the cost down, right? So as far as domestication, and kind of commercial production is concerned, the biggest question, of course, is whether or not you can make it. How do I say? Is domesticating cheaper than collecting from the wild? Because if it makes it such that you get a better supply and it's cheaper than collecting, then people want to do it, right? So that's the biggest question. And I mean, the other important thing also is to make sure that in the process of domesticating and farming, you are not inadvertently causing other environmental problems, because that could be a thing, right? If, for example, there have been cases in the past of, they started farming salmon in certain parts of, certain countries elsewhere. And because they were farming the salmon, it caused the entire ecosystem to die. Of course, there's so much more organic material in the water, right? So that can end up being even though it's farming, it can end up being causing other problems for natural ecosystems. But assuming that's settled, and if the domestication can actually result in the better, larger amounts of product for cheaper price, definitely, I think that definitely is something that you should be looking towards. Normally, what happens is if you're talking about demand for a threatened species, it should also be coupled with protection of the wild population, because it's usually very difficult. So you usually need multiple ways of tackling the problem, right? If you start farming it, but at the same time, people are still catching the wild ones because it's cheaper or it's easier to just catch the wild ones will still die out. So if you combine farming together with monitoring and protecting the wild population, then maybe you have a higher chance of success, right? So generally, just multiple ways would definitely work lah. But yeah, domestication definitely has a place in things.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Nathaniel.
Thank you.
Is there still any other question? Or maybe enough? From Mr. Herjayanto, amazing presentation and explanation from Mr. Nathaniel. Thank you very much, sir. Also, thanks for Freshwater Fish of Indonesia, Marcel and team for this online forum.
Thank you, Mr. Jayanto.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
All right. Maybe the question and answer session is enough. Thank you to Dr. Nathaniel, who spared the time for the to sharing with us tonight. Hopefully, tonight's session can give us a new insight, especially about conservation of the freshwater fish. Maybe I would like to give it back to Bang Marcel. Oh, dokumentasi ya. Documentation. Please on the camera.
Please open the cam, everyone. Mr. Ahsan, Mr. Leo, Mr. Luke, Mr. Gunawan,
On the camera.
Mr. Frankin Sitorus, Rian Lo. Okay, thank you. Rahmat Hidayat, thank you. Okay, we want to take a picture. Oh, there is a WWF. Hello, Mr. Ari.
Oh, hello everyone.
Okay. Oh, there is WWF in here. WWF. Okay, maybe we can open the cam. Okay, thank you, Mr. Hilmi Rahmat Hidayat. Okay, boleh.
Baik, dokumentasinya saya pandu dalam 3, 2, 1.
Okay, once more.
Once
maybe.
again, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, okay.
Alright. Mungkin dari Bang Marcel ada tambahan, Bang?
Okay, first of all, thank you for Dr. Nathaniel. Yeah, maybe this is connection. Maybe this is first step to us to collaboration. Maybe yeah, there is Mr. Ferry Hassan in here from Erlangga University, Herjayanto from the Sulawesi, and WWF and others.
Yeah.
So maybe we can make a collaboration maybe someday.
That will be amazing.
That will be amazing. So because Indonesia is very have a spirit to do conservation of fish in here. Okay.
That is
Okay. We can. I will stop the record.